I'm going to pick up a little bit from David Thomas's talk, brilliant talk last night in our wonderful discussions this morning in terms of redefining archives. He redefined it in terms of archaeology and the materiality of archaeology, and I want to redefine it, not that I'm the only one doing it, but in terms of the use of oral history and how oral history can also be part of the archiving of Franciscan history and of course of many other histories as well, the importance of getting people's recollections, their memories and so forth as part of adding on to, and in some cases even replacing the actual documents, or in some cases where there's no documents at all. Now I come to this as a historian of Chicano history, of Mexican American history, and that's really my forte. I mean, I do deal with Chicano Catholic history and Franciscan history as well, that I'll talk about today. But in Chicano history, especially those of us who have worked on the 20th century, oral history has been absolutely crucial because of the lack of documentation. It's not that there hasn't been documentation in Chicano history, it's been that archives and libraries for years and years and years never even thought about collecting things on Mexican Americans. And I can remember years ago, in 1969, when I was leaving El Paso to come to California to be an instructor of history at San Jose State, one of my professors at the University of Texas El Paso, where I did my BA and MA, said, "Oh, I hear that you're going to go teach a course on Chicano history at San Jose State." And I said, "Yeah, I am." And he said, "Well, I don't think there's such a history because there's no documents." There's no documents. And I always worried about it, but later on when I did a dissertation on Chicano history, I found there was lots of documents, but that they hadn't been well preserved or put in archives and collections. Having said that, still oral history has been absolutely fundamental in filling in a lot of gaps. And I've done a lot of oral history to complement archival research, but I've also done history, full, complete books based on oral histories, or what in Latin America are called testimonials or testimonies. And I'm going to talk to you today about one of my testimonials, which is the story of Father Virgil Cordano of the Santa Barbara mission. And I got interested in doing his story in part because I knew about him over the years in Santa Barbara, but I really got to know him first when our two children attended a private Catholic school called Marymount in Santa Barbara, very close to the mission. And Father Virgil was like the spiritual director, I guess. And so we got to know him. But then I got to know him even more because at UC Santa Barbara, some of the graduate students in the Department of Religious Studies, which is a very, very well-known, very prominent Department of Religious Studies, but they began to complain that you could study almost every religion possible in religious studies except for Catholicism. They had no curriculum to speak of in Catholic studies. And so they began to pressure to have something done there, and some of us began to pick up on that, and eventually it led to a move to establish an endowed chair in Catholic Studies. And it didn't take us very long, those of us on the committee, to decide that we would name it after Father Virgil Cordano, beloved priest. But as we decided to do that, it also struck me that people knew Father Virgil, but how many of us really knew his full story? What was his full story? So I approached him about beginning a project based on oral history to get his entire life story down, and he was very cooperative. We worked for about 3 years. We did about 40 hours of audio-taped interviews to get his story down. I wrote up the drafts of the chapters. He went over them, added new material, and so forth and so on, and eventually published this book a few years ago called Padre, The Spiritual Journey of Father Virgil Cordano, published by Capra Press. And it's a remarkable story of a young George Cordano, born of Italian immigrant parents in Sacramento. And he went to Catholic schools there, decided early on that he had a vocation, but then he thought he would go to the seminary, decided to be a Franciscan when he was at the end of his elementary school years, but he hesitated a little bit. So he didn't leave until he was 16. You know, it was an effort. His mother really didn't want him to go and so forth, and he decided he had a vocation. So he went down at age 16. By the way, Father Virgil was born in 1918, and So in 1934, he leaves Sacramento to go to Santa Barbara to the Franciscan Seminary, St. Anthony's Seminary, at age 16. And you know, he's very homesick and so forth, but he goes through the whole minor seminary there, does his novitiate down San Luis Rey, comes back to finish up, you know, the theological work and so forth. Later on does more theological work at Catholic University and so forth. For the most part, Father Virgil was in Santa Barbara, at the Santa Barbara Mission. And over the years, he became very prominent, very well known. If there was anything close to a Mr. Santa Barbara, or in this case, a Padre Santa Barbara, it was Father Virgil. He was so well known, beloved. He worked very closely with our annual Santa Barbara Fiesta, but he worked, you know, with many other groups, with different, he was very ecumenical, working with Protestants and Jews and so forth and so on. And so he witnessed all of the changes over the years, Vatican II changes and so forth, and had to struggle with that. And so he died in 2008, and so this really gets into his entire life story, and it shows, you know, at a grassroots level what it meant to be a Franciscan and his own changes, as I say, and so forth and so on. So I'm going to show you some images, but I'm also going to read a little bit from the book itself so that you can get an idea of his story. And when I put together the CD, or had it put together, these are the photos. By the way, we have copies of the book over here, and for $10, it's a good bargain. And but I also brought to Father Jack. This is the collector's version, the hard copy of the book, and to be put into the library. And I'll sign it for you for later. But anyway, it was as I said, it was spent 3 years. And I did all of the interviews there at the mission, which was just a delight to go. At one point, I was going every week and so forth. It was just wonderful, and he was so cooperative with me and so forth. He had his sense of the importance of getting his story down, and this also speaks to the fact that sometimes it's not that Father Virgil could not have done his own story. Obviously, he could have written his own story. It's just the question: did he have the time to do it? Did he have the inclination to do it? So sometimes it takes the intervention, in this case of an academic or a journalist, to step in and say, let's get your story down. And that's how some of these life stories based on oral history are done. And so this is how I did it with Father Virgil. And so this is the cover outside of the Santa Barbara Mission. And but when I put together, I had the CD put together, it wasn't done sequentially in the way that the images appear in the book itself, so they're a little bit scattered, and so I'm not even sure. This is Father Virgil was very known with the fiesta and so forth. So here he is dancing. Here's the son of the fiesta as well. He really, you know, for him, fiesta was also had a spiritual quality to it, because he said it brings people together. It brings people together, and that's very important, that people have a sense of community. And he saw fiesta more than a fiesta. He saw it almost as a spiritual exercise. It's again with Fiesta Santa St. Barbara. Well, this takes us back. This is his Holy Communion. It's in Sacramento. This is later in the 1960s outside of Santa Barbara. This is when he's down in San Luis Rey for the novitiate. This is baby. His mother, who really only spoke Italian, called him Giovanni, but his name was George. And this is his mother. They were immigrants from Italy. And this is me and Father Virgil. I tell you, they're out of sequence. This is with the Dalai Lama on a visit to Santa Barbara. And this is back to in Sacramento. And this is later, I think this is in the 50s, playing baseball. He was a big, avid baseball fan. Playing soccer at Marymount with the kids. This is even the young Father Virgil. This is after he's been to the seminary. He's back for a visit. This is like 1936. He's back for the summer. And this is, of course, much later. And this is back to the St. Anthony Seminary. This is Father Virgil here, playing football with the seminarians. Much later. This is with his brother, not Ray, his older brother and his sister-in-law. And there's some other ones I'll skip over here just to show you a few more. We'll go this way. This is at his Catholic elementary school in Sacramento. It's right there. At Marymount, blessing the kids. And he blesses, he blessed bikers, he blessed horse riders. He was very well known for that. And this is at his ordination in 1945. And this is at the mission later on as well. And this is on a visit to Italy with some of the people who went with him and his family in Italy. When Queen Elizabeth visited the mission in 1983 with Nancy Reagan and Prince Philip, and it was a rainy day, and Father Virgil was just so nervous, you know. There was Secret Service had already come, not only U.S. Secret Service, but also the British Secret Service. They were all over the mission. They were armed and so forth and so on. And then it was a heavy rainy day, so poor Father Virgil was just so nervous that everything went well. He had been trained, you don't extend your hand to the Queen unless she extends it. Well, she didn't extend it. And she never even really spoke to him and so forth. They did put together an interesting collection about the role of British explorers along the California coast, and they showed that to her. And it was 30 minutes, but for Father Virgil, it must have been an eternity to deal with the tensions and the pressures and so forth. But he held up well. He held up well. Sorry, go this way. And this, yeah, here it is with Queen Elizabeth, and this is back with his mother in Sacramento, and with his brother Ray, his younger brother Ray, who was very close to him. Okay, so we've seen that. But I want to just read a little bit because to show you what oral history, in terms of filling in the gaps, I mean, to show, the reason the part I do oral history is to put a human face to history. Who makes history? It's not just social movements or institutions, they're individuals, they're people. People make history. And I'm interested in how people make history and who are these people. And so we can talk about, you know, the order, the Franciscan order and the mission, so, but who are the people themselves who make this up? Like when he goes to the seminary, one of the first things that he has to adjust to is a change in food, the change in food. And so he says, one of the most radical changes for me was the food. We always ate at home Italian style, and I rarely ate vegetables, which I didn't like. All of this changed at St. Anthony's. Not only were we served many vegetables, but the meal offered dishes that were different for me. Now, someone mentioned the German influence. These included many German ones. This was because several of the Franciscan brothers, the non-ordained Franciscans who did most of the cooking and cleaning, were German. We had sauerkraut and things like that which didn't appeal to me. On the other hand, we had cornbread and syrup 3 times a week that I did like. Occasionally we had pasta, but it wasn't my mother's pasta, and certainly not her sauce. Each Friday we were served fresh baked pies for dessert. This was a big treat and we looked forward to it. But all of this still smacked of institutional living. Naturally, it was not home. And part of, as I mentioned, leaving a home and seminary was, and I'm sure many of you can speak to it, it's just the homesickness. So, I mean, he's 16 and he doesn't have his family anymore, and he doesn't have his wonderful and beloved mother. So he says, not only in my first year, but throughout most of my high school seminary years in Santa Barbara, I wavered in coming to a final decision regarding my calling. I didn't doubt that I had a vocation. The challenge facing me was, will you say yes or no? I knew that I was free to respond or not respond, and God would accept my decision. I could be a good and generous Catholic layman, and yet I would not be pleased with myself if I were to refuse to accept God's invitation. I had to be true to what was sensed in the depths of myself. I was certain of my calling, but did not welcome what my vocation asked of me. I had to get used to being away from home at such a young age. I was lonely in a totally different setting. During that first year, I often cried while in bed. I felt like I was in exile. Daily, I would stop by the chapel after meals and pray, God help me. Or in better moments, I give myself to you and your plan for me. Getting mail from my mother helped a bit. She would write in Italian and occasionally send packages of candy or some other treats. I wrote back in English, but couldn't make myself express my loneliness to her, and I didn't want to add to her suffering. Another aspect of seminary adjustment to seminary changes was when he goes, getting ready to go to novitiate at San Luis Rey, and so, you have to now adopt a Franciscan name. And so he writes about that, or he tells me about it. He says, part of the move to San Luis Rey involved 3 important personal changes. First, I had to adopt a Franciscan name. Once you entered the novitiate, you had to leave behind your given name and select a religious one. This was a sign that you were entering an entirely new way of life. My baptismal name was George, but now I had to look around for a new one. What made this particularly difficult was that you couldn't take on the more popular names of the apostles, such as Peter, Paul, and John. All of these names were already taken by others. Some of the names suggested to us by our old German provincial, Father Ildefonso Moser, the head of the Franciscan order on the West Coast, were unappealing to me. Some you couldn't even pronounce. There were names such as Oscar and Bino and Cuthbert. I said to myself, oh no. We had to select our new names while still in Santa Barbara, and before going off to San Luis Rey, so on one of the few occasions that I went into downtown Santa Barbara, I and a classmate, Chester Drake, now Father Sebastian, went to the public library to look for a listing of names. We found a book entitled, What Shall We Name Baby? In it, I saw the name Virgil. At least it was pronounceable. So I selected it, not knowing that there was even a Saint Virgil. Fortunately, there was. I found out later that he was an Irish monk who left Ireland to convert parts of non-Christian Europe. He ended up as the Bishop of Salzburg, Austria. Many years later, on a trip to Europe, I visited and prayed at the grave. I felt lucky to get a name like Virgil, approved by the provincial. Some of my classmates weren't as fortunate. One got stuck with the name Benignness. We used to call him Benign. His mother couldn't even spell it, much less approve of it. And then, of course, over the years, many changes, and as some of you have spoken to, the changes that Vatican II brought on, and so I just want to, share with you some of his thoughts and feelings about some of those changes. And so, as he told me, he said, for us in the theological seminary, the most immediate changes that appeared even while Vatican II was taking place and not earlier had to do with the need of renewal. Self-examination opened up for us and for other religious orders as well as for the entire church. What would prove to be difficult but necessary, in some cases painful changes or suggestions for change. We had no experience in questioning how we at the local level might operate as an order, since formerly all directions came from the top. Now a certain democratic opening was developing that caused much confusion because we really didn't know what we should be doing or how to go about it. The strong winds of change rushed in. I was particularly affected by this due to my position as rector. By the way, Father Virgil held every administrative position at the mission over the years. I believe that the changes in the church were long overdue, but I also believe that we should just transform everything, that we couldn't just transform everything all at once. What should be changed and why? Others thought otherwise. They wanted an almost immediate complete transformation of how we governed ourselves in the seminary. The results were serious divisions among our faculty and students. Some positioned themselves as liberals and perhaps even as radicals, and unfairly labeled superiors, including myself, as conservatives. These self-proclaimed liberals wanted to radically change things. We don't have to take directions from Rome anymore, they would say. We can just do what we want and what is called for here and now. What did they want to do? Some of the faculty, for example, wanted the students to have an equal voice with the faculty. The students agreed. I thought this went too far. Those discussions were held not just at faculty meetings, but also among the students. Some changes were needed on how we were to undergo renewal, but how far to go was difficult to determine. It was like pulling the cork out of a champagne bottle. The intoxicating drink began to fizzle and spill out in all directions. And he went on, defining what our role as Franciscans today should be was not easy. How should we live the Franciscan life in modern times? How should we, in the middle of the 20th century, emulate the life of St. Francis coming out of the 13th century? For example, should we wear our habits all of the time or not? How should we get involved in non-religious matters? What new structures and procedures should we accept? These were challenging questions, and the answers were not easy or readily apparent. Changes had to be made. I had no doubt about this. It was a question of how much and how fast and which ones. It was confusing and very divisive. And so clearly this was very painful because it was a question of how to change when you have no history of change. I want to conclude also because with his humor, Father Virgil was a very humorous guy. He had a wonderful sense of humor. And this is an example of his humor. As I mentioned, he would bless not only the bikers, but also horse riders. And so one group of horse riders were called rancheros visitadores. And so he says, I still bless the rancheros visitadores, and the event has become international with some of the riders coming from Mexico, Australia, and England, as well as from other parts of the United States. One particular blessing I'll never forget was in 1989. And on this occasion, the blessing was in the Santa Ynez Valley. As I began my prayer, to my surprise and that of the assembled rancheros and the others, two male streakers, completely naked, ran in front of me. I have no idea who they were and why they did this. The assembled crowd roared with laughter at this incident. I waited for the laughter to die down, and then with the timing of a stand-up comic, I said, I have a word from the Lord for those two gentlemen. Repent, for your end is in sight. Thank you very much.